Good morning, or just in morning. Thank you all very much for joining us again. We have our third speaker in this block, Courtney Eckhardt, who will be speaking to us about, or giving us a crash course in having an operational incident, something that will never happen with the good folks at Next Day Video running the show. Take it away, Courtney.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. I would like to begin with some content notes. I will be discussing a number of upsetting topics in theory because I'm drawing an analogy to emergency response situations in the physical world. There will be no details and no actual scenarios. I won't be going into any of this until slide 8, so if you need to step out, you have time to do so. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Content notes are theoretical discussions of fires, natural and human-made disasters, sudden health problems or injuries, and responding to thoughts of suicide. So, what would you do if you, hypothetically, woke up, checked Slack while you were still in bed? I know you wouldn't do this. And you saw this. This is a Slack message from our AWS TAM, which says, "Can you please look into this case number, blah, your AWS account number, blah, is compromised." And since you don't have your AWS account IDs memorized, and if you do, please don't tell me, your mostly asleep brain assumes it's the big account. This is what my brain did. Gonna need some coffee. It's like 7 in the morning. But seriously, if this happened at your organization, do you know what you would do? Is there someone you could call? Do you know how you would reach them? Do you know the answer to that now, or would you need to look it up? Welcome to How to Have an Operational Incident, a crash course. I'm Courtney. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm giving this presentation from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in the city named Vancouver, British Columbia by settlers. I'm a career and management coach and an incident response specialist, and I'm here to talk to you about what to do when everything goes wrong. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is an emergency. The most common definition of an emergency is a situation that poses an immediate risk to health, life, property, or environment. Depending on your field, any of those could apply to you, but property or business reputation is probably the most common. A lot of times I hear coworkers and folks at other conferences and companies say, nobody's gonna die, it's not that bad, we can calm down a little bit. But do you know that? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you actually do know who all of your customers are. You don't, but let's pretend for a moment. Do you know who their customers are? And do you know all the workloads all of those people are doing? Do you know that all of them are only using your system in the expected ways? There's no way to know the 4th or 5th order impacts of an outage of your system, so saying that no one will die as a result of your outage is making an assumption which might be unwarranted. I don't say this because I want you to freeze, but because I want you and everyone you work with to think seriously about incidents. It doesn't make things better to have a loose and poorly specified incident response protocol, even for very small incidents that are easily corrected or that only a few customers notice. Possibly you've heard productivity people talk about urgent versus important. Urgent is about timeline. If something is urgent, it needs to be handled quickly. Do you want to order lunch with your office friends? Important is about needs or consequences, making sure that you have your medications refilled or that you know where your children or your pets are. Important can be about danger. So an emergency is both urgent, time-sensitive, and important. It's about danger or consequences. A fire would be about both danger and consequences. A broken bone from a bad fall would be about consequences. But how do we know that we have an emergency? Someone, a human, has to know about it, assess the urgency and the importance, and decide that it is. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to witness it, it's not an emergency because no one decided it was an emergency. That means that someone needs to find out about it. In the physical world, maybe you see something happen or come across someone in distress. In the software industry, that probably means you get paged, hopefully by a monitoring service or maybe by your support staff. And then you have to decide how to respond. In the physical world, you would call 000 or maybe an alarm company or a security guard. In the software industry, maybe you page more people. How many times have you said, I didn't have time to think? Or how many times has someone said it to you? Thinking takes time. And if you don't know what the options are while you're trying to think, you'll freeze. So we need to eliminate the need to think for as many people involved in the emergency as possible. That's why when you call 000, it connects you to a dispatcher who can reach all the common response teams directly, so you don't have to take a moment to decide who to call and then figure out how to reach them. This is a picture of the sign on the back of my hotel room door in Toronto, which is where I first gave this talk. Hotels across North America, and probably in other places too, have signs like this in every room, just in case you should need to call for help or evacuate the building. Both the US and Canada use 911 as an emergency number, while Australia has multiple numbers, the 000, 112 on mobile phones, and 106 if you have a teletype machine. Emergency phone numbers create a framework for response. They represent years of planning and communication, which includes these signs. When you call 000, the dispatcher knows who they can call, how to reach them, how to get information from you about the situation you're reporting on, and to remind you to keep yourself safe, which is critical. This framework enables you to respond when you encounter an emergency, if you don't know what the options are for help, you don't know what to do, so this primes you, right? It gets you ready to respond when you see something that is unexpected and maybe dangerous. Calling 000 also triggers the response framework used by the dispatcher and emergency response specialists. That's fire personnel, emergency medical technicians, and police. They all have plans for how to reach the emergency, which is called assembling, how to stay in contact with the dispatcher while they do that, how to assess the emergency when they arrive, how to communicate within their group and across groups. At a fire personnel have to coordinate with medical personnel, so they need intergroup comms, how to escalate, summon more fire trucks, summon more medical personnel. The details of these frameworks vary by country. Australia has published a PDF document called the Crisis Appreciation and Strategic Planning Guidebook that discusses the high-level approach, and I have a link to that at the end of my slides, which the slides will be available after this talk. So far, what have we learned? There's a lot of text on the slide. Don't worry about reading it all. We're going to revisit each part. Frameworks are about organization and planning. If you discover something that might be an emergency and your mind goes blank, that means that you haven't been enabled to respond. You don't know what you need to know in order to figure out how to react. An example of this that comes up fairly commonly, especially recently, if a friend comes to you and confesses that they have been having suicidal thoughts, do you know what to do about that? I find that a lot of the people that I talk to have to learn those skills specifically, and there are programs and ways to learn those skills, but the first few times it happens, probably you don't know what to do. Responding to a security issue in the physical world, like at your apartment building, if you live in an apartment building, or at your workplace, those are also things where sometimes people just don't know what to do and they have to learn. So let's talk about applying it. Now that we've sort of talked about what needs to happen and why it's important, we can talk about what creating an incident response system for your organization would mean. The best way to do this is to take a national system and adapt it to your needs and to your tools. The rest of this talk is going to be guidance for doing that. You need a way to know that there's something wrong. So you need something that will alert you when there's an emergency. In software, this usually means that you need monitoring and alerting that you have some confidence in. Some companies do still use a network operations control center sort of arrangement where there are people watching graphs as opposed to automatic monitoring. That can be useful, but is generally slower than having a computer trigger something based on a threshold. It might or might not reduce false positives. It's a little hard to say. Monitoring is like the sort of basic best practice in North America, but it differs over the world what people consider to be the baseline. Then you need to decide what constitutes an emergency for your organization. In a commercial context, this will usually mean that people either can't use what they're paying you for, or they can't pay you in order to start using it. One example would be if you can't buy things on Amazon, Amazon gets really upset about that. But also if you can't create a new social media post on whichever social media network we're using today, that's usually a big problem for that company. Like 000, if you make people decide who to engage or look up how to engage them, you'll waste precious time. So you need to make sure that you have a single point of contact within your organization, that it's easy to use and remember, and you need to publicize it widely. Some companies use chat up commands in Slack. That's the most common and I think the quickest thing that I've seen. Sometimes it's a conference call number. Hopefully it's like a short code instead of having to type out a long number and remember a long number. The people that you reach in this way should be able to fill the role of the dispatcher, figuring out what the issue is, who else to engage, and how to reach them. You probably want some technology to help with this. This is a pain point in a lot of companies where it's hard to know, okay, so if the problem is the Kafka cluster, who owns the Kafka cluster, and how do we reach that team, and how do we figure out which person on that team we should reach? It's good to have some kind of directory of on-call shortcuts and ways to page like on-call person directly instead of having to work all of that out in the moment. The people that you reach when you start this process are probably going to be the same people trained as incident commanders, unlike the 000 dispatcher. 000 dispatchers, as far as I understand in Australia and definitely in North America, they start the response, but they don't continue managing it. Other people who go to the scene continue to manage it. In most software companies, it doesn't make sense to disconnect those two things because there aren't quite enough incidents to raise it to the point where you need a separate dispatcher from the person who's going to be managing the incident as it goes forward. Once you have an emergency, this is really important. Once you have an emergency, it can't be solved by one person. Emergency responders in the physical world are almost always sent out in pairs or in larger groups, because when you have something that is both urgent and important, you need the resources of multiple people and their skill sets to turn it around. Incident response is a team sport, so that's why the first thing to do is to figure out how to get more people involved. So here's another analogy between physical world and software spaces. In the physical world, where to go is sometimes ambiguous. For instance, national disasters won't necessarily have a street address that you can go to, but usually responders will congregate in person and use radios or occasionally phones, but relying on the phone network is not usually advised to coordinate among their group when they arrive. You will probably need to decide on a digital site for your responders to join, and that site will probably be the same as your communications infrastructure. It might be a conference call, it might be Slack. The specialists who join your incident response will also need to assemble at this site, and they should not leave it without designating a replacement or without being released by the incident commander. Make sure that this digital site, whatever you're using, is likely to still work if your own infrastructure is down, and you need a contingency plan to think about, okay, so what if we're having a big incident, and it turns out that it's because a lot of people are having a big incident, and that means Slack is down, we need to have a fallback conference call number to use. In software, to assess the situation, you'll probably be looking for impacted systems and customer experience. Identifying the impacted systems means that you can get the right people to join your incident response, things like knowing whether it's the Kafka cluster or your backend database or whatever it is that you're using versus your front-end web server fleet. Identifying the customer experience means that you can tell customers what issues you are aware of so that they know that you're working on it, and so that they will still open support cases for other issues. This is an ongoing task for the incident commander. Depending on the issue, the answers to these questions could change during the course of your response based on the environment or your actions. You could bring up a part of the system that was not working before and change what is available to customers and what you and your team need to be working on. The essence of successful incident response is cooperation and delegation. No one can handle this solo, as previously covered, so that means dividing up the work. You need to consider that you want to avoid duplication of effort when you're dividing up the work, and you want to parallelize work on the problem. Sometimes you are running multiple investigations side by side because you don't know what the problem is yet, and it wastes less time than doing them one after the other. This also means that all the people handling this work need to report back to the incident commander on a regular basis to keep them updated. For the duration of the incident, The incident commander should be the start of authority for the company. The incident commander is the only one with a view of the whole problem and all the people working on it, because their focus is the progress of the investigation and the attempt to fix the problem. Even if everyone is working on things in the same Slack channel, the incident commander's only job is to pay attention to what do we understand the problem to be right now? What are we trying in order to make sure that our understanding is accurate? What are we going to do if our understanding is accurate in order to get things fixed? This means that it's critical that no one argue with or countermand the incident commander, not other responders, and not managers or executives. If someone argues, it means that everyone helping with the incident has to decide whose side to take in that moment. Are they going to follow what the incident commander says or the person arguing with them? This wastes time and it's counterproductive. And this start of authority thing also means that no one leaves the incident until they are released by the incident commander or they're replaced. You also need some criteria for deciding when things are done. Sometimes that's clear. There's no more impact, or we rolled back a bad release, but it could be unclear sometimes. What if the problem is we mitigated whatever went wrong, but we won't have a fix from the vendor for 3 weeks, so it could go wrong again? What if the issue is we can't mitigate the problem, we won't have the fix from the vendor for 3 weeks, we're just gonna be running in a degraded state for that time? What if the issue is a security incident and now everyone in the company has to patch their Redis's and it's going to take 3 weeks to do that? Start by coming up with a few high-level plans for cases like this. When they happen, you can use those plans as a starting point. You can almost never come up with a truly exact plan for something that's going to happen in the future where you can just like run down that list. This is where judgment and experience comes into play. But if you have the plan, you have some place to start, and it keeps you from having like the blank page syndrome where you just stare at it and your brain isn't sure what to do. Finally, there's a special case of assembly and dispersal, which is shifts. Operational incidents can be very quick, but they can also last hours or days. Security incidents sometimes last weeks. You need an idea of what a shift is and what the process for a shift change should look like. I recommend 4-hour shifts. This is what we found that people could handle as incident commander empirically. Like, people would just really get tired and their response time would really slow after about 4 hours. And 4 hours is also what I learned in the classes given by professional fire personnel on how they do incident management. So if you like to take pictures of slides, this is a good one to take pictures of, but you don't have to because the slides are going to be available afterwards. This is the summary. This is a minimum viable incident response plan. There's a lot more to it than this, but this is how you can get started. If you cover the stuff, you're on your way. And the stuff is it an emergency? Do you have people who know the relevant subject areas? Do you have someone who knows how to organize them? That would be the incident commander. Do you have a place to assemble? Do you have a way to communicate? Do you have an idea of what a shift is? And do you have an idea of when it's over? After that, you need to train people. People need to be able to practice this so that they don't freeze when the moment happens. You need training and documentation for the incident commanders at the very barest minimum, even if you don't have time for anything else. But you will get much better results if all of the people who might be paged into an incident are trained as if they were incident commanders themselves. It will tell them, they'll already know what the incident commander is going to ask, why they're asking, how it will help. You will get responses often before they're requested, and it reduces grumpiness. If you feel like there's an emergency and someone's asking you for something that you think is completely unacceptable, unreasonable, beside the point, then you get angry and you don't want to answer. But if you understand the protocol that the incident commander is going through in their head, it no longer feels inappropriate to have a question that is like surprising to you, or the question might not even surprise you. After that, there's a lot of places that you can go. These are, what I just covered is the very beginning steps. These are the next things that you could look at. How do you communicate with customers while all this is happening? How do you engage your lawyers? How do you engage your PR people? How do you engage the executives to let them know that something is wrong? How do you engage vendors if they are necessary to the solution? And how do your vendors engage you if they're having an incident that might impact what's happening on your system? So far, I've spent all this time discussing the benefits of having or starting an incident response system, but it's also important to talk about the drawbacks. Incident response, especially in a corporate environment, is a burnout factory. This is in large part because capitalism is a burnout factory, but it's worse in incident response, fundamentally because incident response is a cost center, it's not a profit center. That means that shareholder capitalism wants to have an incident response team when something bad has just happened, but when something bad has not just happened, it kind of wants to squeeze that team dry in service of better profits and run as lean as possible for as long as possible on the theory that probably things won't go wrong, and if they do, it probably won't be that bad. If you work in incident response and you feel that you are being exploited for your willingness to do what the business needs and not what it actually wants, you're right, you are. And the same goes for other people who work in low glamour, underfunded, keeping the lights on departments. Shareholder capitalism relies on people being willing to wear themselves out for the good of the company and the customers. And this is especially true in incident response. Is it possible to make real change in this situation? Sometimes. It's sometimes possible to do a corporate activism and convince the managers, for a while, that incident response should be funded. However, in a publicly traded company, as previously covered, the people that you would truly have to convince to make this stick in the long term would be the shareholders. And that's not possible structurally. Employees don't really have access to the shareholders. And the shareholders aren't thinking about long-term value and long-term livability of people's jobs. They're thinking about short to medium-term profit. If you've heard the saying, never waste a disaster, this advice is about using the fear caused by a major incident or a near miss to try to convince executives to fund incident response, generally speaking. But trying to create systemic change via immediate fear isn't very effective. And while you might be able to temporarily convince an executive, the shareholders are there to make sure that the executives keep shareholder value as their North Star. And shareholder value is widely regarded as antithetical to funding a cost center. What if someone hands you the hot potato? Sometimes, after a big incident, a person is tasked with standing up an incident response framework or fixing it up. If that's you, it's probably not great for you politically. I would recommend assembling something that's like medium thorough, covers all the obvious cases, has a list of ways to expand it, sort of like, here's what we did, and here's what we're dreaming, and here's the people that we would need to get that done. And once you have that, I'd recommend getting out of there. This kind of thing is usually handed to either the organizational sacrificial goat or to the prodigal guy. And it helps to know which one you are if it's you. If you're the prodigal guy, sticking around too long means that you're likely to become the sacrificial goat, so keep that in mind. And I did say guy because under capitalism, the person who is expected to perform great things and bring new ideas to the organization is often someone who people think of as a guy and who executives remind them of themselves at that age, whatever age that is. And that's pretty depressing. It's not a great place to be working in most companies most of the time. The only way I really see to change this is regulation, because the thing that can cause a company to do something that is against its short to medium term profit goals is a requirement from outside. But to return to the original story, what actually happened with that message from our AWS TAM? For those of you who are still wondering, I found out that the account in question was a brand new developer account that had had its creds checked into GitHub by accident. First thing, account creation, creds checked into GitHub, like same 5 minutes. But several other people also heard that we had an account compromise and came to me about it over the course of the day. So that was kind of fun, annoying. There was a lot of sort of emotional mop-up after that moment. I do have some further resources here. The Wikipedia page on the incident response system. Oh, I'm sorry, there's some unprintable characters in this slide that should not be there. I will clean those up before I release the slides. The Wikipedia page is pretty good at like helping you get oriented in like what are we trying to cover and why do we think it's important. There's a book called Incident Management for Operations by Rob Schnepp, Ron Vidal, and Chris Hawley, and those are the folks who trained me, who are former firefighters that I mentioned earlier. The guidebook from the Australian government, I have the link to that here. And also A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster is a book written by Rebecca Solnit. And she did a lot of sociological research about how regular people respond during and after earthquakes and wildfires and other major disasters. It was a fascinating book. And actually a very hopeful book. Some things that I want to read. The Survivors Club, The Secrets in Science That Could Save Your Life. I've been told that it talks through like how people survive aviation accidents and how people don't survive it, and that's something that I'm interested in hearing about. Also, there is a doorstop book called The Challenger Launch Decision, Risky Technology, Culture, and Deviance at NASA by Diane Vaughn. She's a sociologist, and she went through all of the piles of paper after the Challenger disaster and wrote up this huge book with her findings that I've heard very good things about, have not had a chance to read yet. A couple of acknowledgements. My friend Marlena Compton for reading over a draft of this presentation and providing encouragement that this was, in fact, a useful topic to be presenting on. Also, Mental Health First Aid Canada, which when I took that class really gave me the understanding that when you freeze in an emergency, it's because you're not sure what to do. And if you have the protocol in your head beforehand, then you can figure it out more easily. There is a Mental Health First Aid Australia. I believe Mental Health First Aid first came from Australia. So it's a really cool training, and I recommend it to anyone who thinks they might be interested. And thank you so much. You can find me on the Discord or on Mastodon.
Thank you very much, Courtney. We have a few minutes for questions. If you do have a question, could I get you to raise your hand? And we have a runner who will bring a microphone to you. While we get the room warmed up and make sure we get questions for you, you mentioned training and sort of making sure everybody knows what they're supposed to do so that they respond well. Is there any value in sort of de-escalating this so it's a practice that is done more often rather than just when something is either literally or figuratively on fire, and go through the process either as mocks or with much, much lower scale incidents?
Yes, you can sort of treat it like a tabletop role-playing game, which turns out to be a ton of fun. People really enjoy that. It's also very hard to get funded in terms of like time and human attention and planning, but if you can get it, it's incredibly useful. It's also very useful before like major launches. If you're launching a whole new product and you're going to need to figure out how do we engage people for this new product, what does it depend on, who are we going to be working with, it's a great tactic.
Okay. Do we have questions? We have one here, yes?
Great talk, thanks very much. One place where I get some inspiration in this sort of space, and this is working both as a developer and in operations, and every developer should work in operations at least for a few years, is the airline industry. I don't know whether you've heard
Yes.
of the QF32 scenario. They have a concept called a just culture, and I was wondering whether you're familiar with that and whether it sort of found its way into IT and these various other places.
Yeah, I actually have another talk that I've given at other conferences, which I can post on Mastodon, where I talk about how to have a blameless retrospective and like how to talk about problems without pointing fingers and finding better solutions collaboratively. So yeah, just culture is really a great framework.
Okay, I think we have another question at the back here. Microphone working its way up. Here we go.
So you mentioned regulation as one possible way through this. What about organization and unionization?
That would be lovely. I don't feel like I have a direct, like there's very little unionization happening in tech in North America, which is where most of my working experience has been. So I don't know what that would look like. It would be a really, really dramatic power change, like across the board, in terms of who is deciding how the company is spending human time and money. but I would love to see that. I don't know what it would look like.
Okay. That is all the time we have. Thank you very much, Courtney. Everyone, please join me in thanking Courtney for her time.
Thank you.